By the time my wife started calling me cruel, I had already signed the lease. That was the part she could not understand. She thought the marriage ended because I left in a way she found dramatic. In her version, I had blindsided her. In mine, I had been disappearing from our life together for weeks before I carried a single box out of the house. People like clean endings. A sentence. A slammed door. One terrible thing said in a bright room. They want a single moment they can point to and say there, that was it. That was the night everything broke. But most endings don't work like that. Most endings happen by reduction. A chair that stops being set in the right place. A decision made before you hear about it. A sentence that begins as a joke and comes back later with teeth. A room that keeps getting smaller while everyone insists you still belong in it. When Meredith and I first met, she loved that I listened. That was what she told people. Ethan actually listens. Not the fake waiting to talk kind. The real kind. It was one of the first things she said she trusted about me, and one of the last things she used against me. We were married 4 years, together for 7. Long enough to build habits so ordinary they start to feel like geology. Saturday grocery runs. Our ridiculously specific pancake routine. The side of the bed she claimed on the first night we slept together and never surrendered after. The way she liked her coffee stronger in the morning but weaker after dinner because, according to her, nighttime coffee should feel persuasive, not aggressive. I knew how she looked when she was angry with someone else and how she looked when she was angry with me and pretending she wasn't. Those expressions are not the same, even if you love the person wearing them. For most of our marriage, we functioned well. Not perfectly. I don't believe in that word when it comes to living with another human being. But well, we negotiated. We argued like adults. We made decisions together, even when one of us cared more than the other. When Meredith wanted to repaint the downstairs study into what I privately thought was an extremely committed shade of green, we spent 3 evenings comparing paint swatches because she cared intensely and I cared enough to be useful. When I wanted to help my younger cousin with a used car and Meredith thought I was volunteering our money too quickly, we sat at the kitchen table and ran numbers until both of us were irritated and both of us still felt respected. That is marriage, I used to think. Not permanent agreement. Permanent inclusion. I still think that. The trouble did not begin as trouble. It arrived dressed as growth. Meredith joined a Thursday evening discussion circle 3 months after a miserable conflict at work. She had been passed over for a promotion that should have been hers, and the official explanation was the kind that sounds neutral enough to survive HR while still managing to insult your intelligence. She was told she lacked executive warmth. Not competence. Not results. Warmth. Apparently she was too direct in rooms where men were allowed to call the same tone decisive. I understood why she was angry. I was angry for her. I had listened to enough of her work stories over the years to know exactly how often she got asked to soften, reframe, cushion, and emotionally upholster points that would have sounded strategic if they had come out of a man in a navy blazer. So when a friend invited her to a women's discussion group that met every Thursday and described it as a place to decompress, compare notes, and stop translating yourself for the male gaze, I said it sounded good. I meant it. If she wanted a room that gave her language for old frustrations and new boundaries, I was for it. I bought wine for the second meeting because she mentioned people usually brought something. I straightened the living room before the first one at our house. I did not step into any of it suspicious or offended. I stepped into it like a husband who believed his wife having support was a good thing. Which it could have been. That matters to me. The story only makes sense if I say that plainly. The problem was never that Meredith wanted female friendship, privacy, or perspective outside our marriage. The problem was that somewhere between support and ideology, she stopped using new language to clarify herself and started using it to erase me. At first the changes were so small it would have been embarrassing to object. New phrases began appearing in our kitchen like unlabeled jars. I'm not available for masculine framing on this. I need a room where I'm not automatically translating. Male urgency is not the same thing as importance. I'm done subsidizing comfort with emotional labor. If that sounds like a lot of language for weekday dinner, that's because it was. But vocabulary enters a life gradually. The first week it's new. The second week it's interesting. By the fourth, it sounds like weather. I remember one Saturday morning about a month after the Thursday meeting started. We were in the laundry room folding towels. Meredith was talking about a disagreement one of the women in the group had with her boyfriend, something about a shared apartment and a home office he kept taking over. I said, carefully, that from the outside it sounded less like misogyny and more like two tired adults bad at direct conversation. She smiled without looking at me. That is such a male simplification of what I just said. There was no fight in her tone. Nothing you could circle in red ink and submit to a court of mutual friends. But something in me paused. Not because I needed to be right about the home office guy. Because I had not realized we were in a category where my viewpoint could be dismissed as fundamentally contaminated before it was even examined. I laughed it off. So I'm disqualified by chromosome? She kept folding. I'm just saying you don't always hear the layers. Layers. Another word that began innocently and came back later with edges. After that, it happened more often. Not in screaming ways. Not in movie ways. In the boring, effective ways that actually change a marriage. I would ask whether we should hold off on replacing the washing machine until after property taxes were due, and she would say, I've already decided. I'm done crowdsourcing my own house. I'd ask whether she wanted me to come to dinner with friends from her office, and she would answer, it's really a woman-heavy night, and honestly that changes the room in a good way. She started describing some conversations as not for men, the way other people say not for kids, casual and final, as if category itself answered every question. None of that sounds fatal written down one line at a time. That is the danger. Disrespect usually arrives below the threshold of anything dramatic enough to justify immediate action. It wants to stay deniable. It wants witnesses who can say, I'm sure she didn't mean it that way. I was one of those witnesses for a while. Meredith had always been sharp. That was part of what drew me to her. She could strip waste from a conversation faster than anyone I knew. She was funny in a clean, lethal way that made boring people either adore her or secretly resent her within 10 minutes. If she got absorbed in a new framework, that wasn't new either. She once spent 6 months organizing our pantry according to a book about decision fatigue. Another time she turned every disagreement we had into a case study in attachment theory until I finally told her if she diagnosed one more grocery store argument as protest behavior, I was going to form an anxious relationship with the parking lot. So I told myself this was a phase. A corrective swing after years of being talked over at work and praised for grace while less competent men got promoted over her head. I told myself some awkward overcorrection was normal. I told myself that the worst thing I could do was make her feel judged for finding a room where she felt strong again. What I did not understand yet was that I was confusing patience with permission. The Thursday gatherings started small. For women, then 6, then 8. They rotated houses for a while. But Meredith liked ours best because, as she said, our dining room actually lets people hear themselves think. That sentence would be funny if the room hadn't later become the place where I realized my marriage had been quietly reassigned to a lower classification. I cooked for the first few gatherings because it seemed polite. That was how I was raised. If your house is hosting, everyone gets fed. The first time I made a simple pasta and salad. The second time I grilled chicken skewers and roasted vegetables because Meredith said one of the women had some dietary thing and she appreciated me making it look effortless. She kissed me on the cheek in the kitchen and said, see? This is what supportive masculinity looks like. Even then I remember feeling a small weirdness at the back of my mind. Not because the phrase was offensive. Because it made me sound like a concept she was testing instead of a husband she knew. But I ignored that too. People ignore a lot when the alternative is asking a question they already fear has an ugly answer. The first real break in the atmosphere came over a chair. It was so stupid I almost didn't mention it. Meredith and I were getting ready for one of the Thursday meetings. I had set up extra chairs in the dining room because attendance had somehow grown to 10. She walked in, took one look, and said, no, not that one. I looked over. What's wrong with that one? That's your dad's chair. My dad's chair was just the old oak chair at the head of the table, the one my late father used to sit in at holidays when the house belonged to my parents. When Meredith and I bought the table from my mother, that chair came with it because my mother said a dining room should remember the people who taught you how to sit in it. It blocks the energy, Meredith said. I actually smiled because I thought she was kidding. She wasn't. Use one of the side chairs, she said. The head spot changes the whole tone. I should probably tell you that I am not a mystical person. I am not hostile to people who are, but my instincts run more toward practical nouns. Bills. Handles. Schedules. If a chair gets called energetic in my house, my reflex is to check whether one leg is shorter than the others. So I just stood there and said, you think my father's chair is oppressive? She gave me a tired look. That's exactly what I mean. You hear one word and flatten the whole point. There were those layers again. I stepped aside. Moved the chair. Told myself it did not matter. But later that night, while I was upstairs pretending not to hear the conversation below, I caught a sentence drifting up the stairwell from one of the women. Something about how domestic spaces hold old hierarchies in the furniture. Then all of them laughed, Meredith included, and I stared at the ceiling in our bedroom and thought about my father, who had spent most of his adult life washing dishes before anyone asked and making sure my mother sat down before he did. Some rules don't begin as rules. They begin as jokes you're punished for not finding funny. The next stage was practical. We had always kept a joint household account and separate personal accounts. The rule had never needed much policing because mutual respect is cheaper than surveillance. Utilities, groceries, house maintenance, taxes, repairs, big shared purchases, all from one place. Personal gifts, lunches, random indulgences, from our own. Easy. Then one Friday night Meredith mentioned, casually, that she had transferred $3,000 from our household savings to pay a deposit on a 3-week retreat in Portugal the group was planning for summer. I thought I had misheard her. A retreat? She poured herself mineral water like she was narrating weather. It's really more of an immersion. Workshops, strategy sessions, restorative time. Clarity. We need to lock our places in now. Who is we? The group. I set my fork down. You moved $3,000 from the house account without talking to me? Her face changed in a way that would become familiar over the next month. Not guilt. Not apology. Irritation that I was making process visible. I'm not asking you for spending permission, she said. I didn't say permission. I said talking. It's my money too. Yes. Which is why I said talking, not permission. It is amazing how quickly a conversation can go crooked when one person needs the words to remain accurate and the other benefits from treating accuracy as aggression. She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. This is what I'm not doing anymore. Every decision filtered through whether it lands gently enough for a man. That stunned me long enough for her to stand, carry her plate to the sink, and leave me sitting there with my pulse doing hard, stupid work. The argument later that night was not loud. Meredith did not need volume to win terrain. She used fatigue, vocabulary, moral framing. By the end of it, I felt as if I had been accused of believing my name should appear on all her choices simply because I wanted a warning before household money became retreat money. The next morning she apologized for being sharper than necessary, which sounded almost like accountability until she added, but you have to understand how exhausting male entitlement can be in domestic decisions. I remember thinking I no longer knew whether we were discussing our marriage or a panel discussion she was still performing after the audience had gone home. I called my sister Nora that weekend. Not because I wanted her to take my side. Because Nora is the one person in my family who can hear a story without grabbing it by the dramatic end. She works in compliance for a hospital system and has the emotional tone of someone who has spent years separating what happened from what people most want to say happened. When our father died, Nora was the one who could cry and still remember to ask which paperwork needed signatures. I told her the story with less feeling than I actually had, which she immediately noticed. "Why are you talking like you're reporting a bicycle theft?" she asked. "Because if I say it the way it felt, it sounds ridiculous. Try me." So I said it differently. I said it felt less like a money argument and more like I had become a category she no longer believed deserved equal standing. I said it felt like there were two marriages in our house now, the one I thought I was in and the one Meredith had started narrating with new vocabulary that made every disagreement sound like correction. I said I couldn't tell if I was overreacting or underreacting because every objection I raised immediately got converted into proof of the thing I was objecting to. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The money is a problem. But it's not the real problem. No, the real problem is that she's making collaboration sound like control." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. "Yes. And you need to write down the financial stuff." I laughed once. "That's a very Nora pivot." "I'm serious. Not because you're getting divorced." A pause. "I'm not saying you are. I'm saying when the story in the house starts changing faster than the facts, write down the facts." That advice saved me later. At the time, it mostly offended me. Not because she was wrong. Because some part of me still believed my marriage was too fundamentally decent for record-keeping. By the end of the month, I was documenting everything. Not in a paranoid way. In a stabilizing way. Dates. Transfers. Conversations. Screenshots of texts where plans were presented as completed realities. Which card had been used for catering supplies. Which weekend Meredith told me we were hosting another event without asking whether I had already committed to helping my mother move a chest freezer out of her garage. The first night I started the document, I actually named the file something normal like House Notes, because calling it Pattern Log felt like admitting the shape of my own life had become a problem to be studied. Things kept shrinking around me. One Sunday, Meredith announced she was converting the downstairs study into a dedicated room for women from the group to use for planning sessions, calls, and private decompression when they needed, a place not organized around male expectation. I blinked at her from the hallway. The downstairs study is where I do my taxes. You can do taxes anywhere with Wi-Fi. So can they. They need a room that feels different. There are 100 small ways a person can tell you they no longer see you as equally entitled to the life you built together. Most of them sound, on paper, entirely manageable. I moved my files upstairs. Another Thursday, one of the women arrived early and found me in the kitchen plating roasted vegetables. She smiled too brightly and said, "Oh good, Meredith said you're very helpful." Helpful. I know that sounds minor. But if you've ever had your place in your own home reduced in the eyes of strangers, you know some words are not descriptions. They're relocations. I started noticing how often Meredith introduced me in functional terms around the group. Ethan handles all the food. Ethan's good with logistics. Ethan's upstairs. Ethan won't be part of the discussion. Ethan's easy about needing space. Easy. Another lie that becomes true if everyone keeps saying it long enough. What she meant was trained. The first time I heard the phrase, female-only decision zone, I was standing just outside the pantry door and had no idea she meant our kitchen. It came during a planning conversation about the Portugal retreat. Meredith and two women from the group were discussing flights, room shares, whether one of them could extend the trip and spend a few extra days in Lisbon. I stepped in only because there was a practical question on the table. If you stay 3 weeks, I said to Meredith, we should probably talk through what we're doing with the mortgage autopay and the contractor timeline for the back fence. Not an objection. Not a veto. A sentence any ordinary spouse would have recognized as maintenance. Every conversation stopped. Meredith turned toward me slowly, which is always worse than quick anger. Quick anger can still surprise itself. Slow anger has already chosen a meaning. We're in a female-only decision space right now, she said. Please don't interrupt with management energy. The room did that terrible thing where silence becomes social. No one rushed to make it less weird. No one said I think he was just asking about the mortgage. They all waited, mildly interested, to see what I would do. I said nothing. What could I say that wouldn't turn into a demonstration? If I defended myself, I would be proving I didn't know how to respect space. If I joked, I would be minimizing their boundaries. If I left too fast, I would be sulking. If I stayed, I would be imposing. That is one of the tricks of contempt. It rigs the exits first. I went upstairs and sat in the bedroom long enough for my coffee to cool in my hands. I could hear their voices from below, softer now that I was gone. Not exactly relieved. Cleaner. Like removing me had improved the acoustics. That was the first evening I allowed myself to think a sentence I had been avoiding for weeks. I do not feel married in this house anymore. I did not say it out loud, because spoken truths acquire weight. But once you think a sentence that clear, you are never fully unacquainted with it again. The actual public humiliation people would later ask me about happened a week after that. It was not the worst thing Meredith said to me. It was just the least deniable. She had decided to host the group's summer planning dinner at our house on a Saturday. Bigger than the Thursday meetings. 12 women. A kind of strategic social evening, as she described it, to celebrate the retreat, discuss some new initiative involving mentorship and community outreach, and reset the energy after one woman's breakup with a man who had apparently weaponized competence. I never did find out what that meant. She informed me of the dinner on Tuesday. Not asked. Informed. We're doing Saturday here, she said while I was unloading groceries. I told everyone yes. I looked at her over a bag of lemons. Saturday? Yes. Saturday was when I was going to help Malcolm move his mother's furniture. She kept unpacking cheese like that had nothing to do with her. You can go earlier. I was leaving around noon. Well, don't. I need the kitchen. Need. Another word that sounds so reasonable while flattening everything around it. I put the lemons down. Did it occur to you to check with me before inviting 12 people over for an all-evening event? She shut the refrigerator door and turned to face me. I'm not going to ask whether I'm allowed to use my own house. Again with the same replacement. Collaboration converted into permission. Partnership reworded as domination. It was like arguing with a machine that only printed one conclusion in different fonts. I did not ask you to ask permission, I said. You never do. You just frame it that way afterward. My chest actually tightened. That was the moment I understood something ugly but useful. Meredith no longer heard my words as their content. She heard them as a male category first and a sentence second. Which meant language itself was no longer a shared tool between us. It had become a trial where the verdict preceded the evidence. I helped Malcolm move his mother's furniture in the morning, then came home and started cooking. Why? Because I wasn't ready yet. That is the embarrassing answer. I was not ready. I had not said the word divorce to myself in a way that felt like intent. I was still trying to decide whether the marriage had become unlivable or simply deeply deformed. I was still one good conversation away, in my own hopeful stupidity, from believing clarity could fix contempt if only I found the right temperature for it. So I cooked. Salmon. Wild rice. Broccolini. 2 desserts because one of the women didn't eat dairy. I moved through the kitchen with the numb efficiency you acquire when your body knows something your pride has not admitted. Meredith floated in and out making aesthetic adjustments and giving me information as if I were hired help she happened to sleep beside. Put the good serving spoons out. No, not those napkins. Can you clear the sideboard? We need the space. Try not to leave the dishwasher running while we're talking. While we're talking. Not while we're hosting. Not while people are here. While we're talking. At one point she stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me glaze the salmon, and said, almost lightly, I really need tonight to feel free of male correction. I set the brush down. Do you hear yourself? Yes, she said. Do you? There it was again. That perfect inversion. As if my objection to being preemptively categorized was the actual aggression. I wanted to say 20 things. I wanted to ask whether she understood what kind of marriage sounds like that. I wanted to ask whether her vision of empowerment required a husband who financed the groceries, prepared the meal, cleaned the pans, then evaporated into the wall so she could feel unobserved by masculinity. Instead I said, what exactly is my role tonight? Her answer came so fast I knew she had one ready. Food, cleanup, and then space. I looked at her. Really looked. She was not shouting. Not sneering. She looked composed. Rational, even. That was part of the horror. If she had sounded cruel, the moment would have been easier to survive. Cruelty is clear. Composed contempt is harder, because it keeps inviting you to doubt your own reading. Food, cleanup, and then space, I repeated. Yes. As in, I'm not part of the evening. As in, this night is not about you. I didn't ask it to be about me. No, she said quietly. You just always assume presence equals relevance. I have replayed that line more times than I would like to admit. Because in one sense it was absurd. In another, it was the whole case. Presence equals relevance. Married people are supposed to assume that in their own house. Not that every conversation belongs to them. Not that every guest owes them attention. But that their presence is not an inconvenience requiring moral justification. At 6:15 the women started arriving. I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, finishing details I had already finished. Partly because I was stalling. Partly because the kitchen had become the last part of the house where I still felt legible. Recipes are honest. Timing is honest. Heat either does what it's supposed to or it doesn't. By 6:40 everyone had a plate. The room was loud in the way groups get loud when they already agree on the emotional theme of the evening. I carried the last dish to the table and was turning back toward the kitchen when one of the women asked Meredith about the Portugal schedule. Meredith pulled up a document on her phone and mentioned they had added 3 days to the end of the retreat for private planning and rest. 3 days. That turned 3 weeks into nearly a month. I stopped. Not dramatically. I just stopped moving. Nearly 4 weeks? I said before I could stop myself. When were you planning to mention that? Every face at the table turned toward me. I don't know if you've ever had 12 strangers look at you like you have breached a code you were never given. It is a very efficient way to make a man feel both furious and ridiculous at the same time. Meredith did not raise her voice. We're in the middle of dinner, she said. Yes, I said. In the house we both live in, discussing a month-long trip you're apparently taking without ever having that conversation with me. One of the women shifted in her chair. Another looked down into her wine. I remember those tiny details because they are what convinced me later that at least some of them knew the moment had gone rotten. Meredith folded her napkin and set it beside her plate with unnerving precision. I am not having my plans cross-examined at my own table. I almost laughed then, because the audacity of that sentence was so immense it briefly exceeded pain. Cross-examined? I asked when you were planning to tell me. She looked around the table, not at me, and said, "This is exactly why women need protected space. The moment a man feels excluded, he mistakes access for entitlement." That landed like a script line polished elsewhere. Something passed through the room then, some collective tightening. Not agreement exactly. More the social instinct to stay inside the declared frame. If she had named me as the problem in the approved language, then anyone challenging her now risked joining me in the category. That was when I saw it clearly, more clearly than I had seen anything in weeks. The marriage was already over. We had simply not completed the administrative side. I did not get thrown out of the dining room. That would have been theatrical. Meredith preferred something cleaner. She turned to me and said, very calm, "You're making the room smaller. Please give us the rest of the evening. Give us the rest of the evening." There was enough civility in the wording to make anyone outside the moment think it sounded reasonable. But that was the genius of it. She had learned how to make exclusion sound therapeutic. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds. No one said anything. No one said stay. No one said he has a point. No one said maybe this isn't the place, but maybe you should tell your husband before you leave for almost a month. Just the soft sound of silverware resting on plates and a room waiting for me to understand the terms of my own removal. I nodded once and went upstairs. From the bedroom window I could hear the voices resume below, then rise, then relax. The shift was unmistakable. Not joy exactly. Ease. The sound a room makes when a tension it has named as external has been successfully removed. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room I had shared with Meredith for 4 years. Our framed wedding photo on the dresser. The gray blanket she insisted made the room look more adult. The reading lamp I fixed twice because the wiring was cheap. Her half-open closet door. My shirts. Her shoes. The ordinary evidence of a life that still existed materially even though its meaning had been renegotiated without my consent. Then I opened my laptop. I did not look up divorce attorneys in a dramatic rush. I did it the way I would compare insurance policies. Quietly. Carefully. Because once a thing becomes inevitable, drama only delays paperwork. I found 3 firms. Eliminated one because the website looked like it was trying to sell vengeance to divorced men in lifted trucks. Called the second and left a message. Filled out the contact form for the third. Then I opened the document Nora had told me to keep and started organizing it for another reader. Dates. Transfers. Large purchases. Text messages. Guest events. Times I had been informed, not included. Examples of language used when ordinary spousal questions were reframed as mail control. The Portugal deposit. The extra days added without discussion. The group dinners. The study turned into a private room. The Saturday event. The sentence about food, cleanup, and space. By the time I closed the laptop, I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Not peace. Not yet. Structure. The next morning Meredith was brisk and almost cheerful, which was somehow worse than if she had been embarrassed. It was as if the previous night had settled a question she had been quietly pursuing. She talked about leftovers, whether I could pick up lemons later, what time the cleaning woman was expected on Tuesday. She did not mention the dining room. She did not mention Portugal. She did not ask whether I had slept. At one point she kissed my cheek on her way out the door and said, "Thanks for holding the house." Holding the house. I stood in the kitchen after she left and actually laughed out loud, alone, because language had become so warped between us that if I didn't laugh I might have put my fist through a cabinet. The woman who had stripped me of standing in our own home could still borrow my labor and call it support when it suited her. That was the final clarification. I met with an attorney named Serena Park on Monday. She wore dark blue, spoke in complete sentences, and had the kind of calm that makes panic feel self-indulgent in comparison. I told her I was not there because of one dinner, and she nodded like someone who had heard that sentence 100 times from people who needed permission to believe their own chronology. "Tell me the pattern," she said. So I did. Not all the emotional detail. Not the ache. Not the humiliation of standing at my own table while a room of strangers watched my marriage get recategorized. Just the pattern. The money. The unilateral decisions. The language of exclusion. The increasing use of moral framing to eliminate ordinary collaboration. The practical reality that our shared home no longer functioned as shared. Serena listened without interrupting. Then she asked 3 questions. Was the house jointly titled? Yes. Were there children? No. Did I want to preserve the option of counseling, or was I there because my decision had already been made? That third question sat between us for a moment. I thought about the dining room, the chair, the transfer, the study, the sentence about presence and relevance, the women downstairs sounding lighter once I was gone. My decision has already been made, I said. It was the first time I had said that to anyone without qualification. Something in my body went still after I said it. Not dead. Not numb. Aligned. Serena told me what I needed to do. Gather statements. Preserve records. Do not empty accounts. Do not make retaliatory purchases. Do not send emotional essays unless I wanted those essays appearing in legal paperwork later. Secure somewhere to stay if I plan to move out before filing. Think carefully about timing. Quiet is fine, she said. Secretive is not the same thing as strategic if it creates financial complications. Also, do not underestimate what happens socially when one spouse believes narrative is leverage. That sentence turned out to be prophetic. I found a furnished apartment downtown on Wednesday. 1 bedroom. Overpriced, but clean. Walking distance from my office. Enough room for a bed, a small desk, a couch that looked like it had learned disappointment early. I signed a 3-month lease with the option to extend. When the property manager asked whether I wanted help moving larger items, I said no because saying yes would have made it sound too real too soon. That week at home, Meredith barely noticed anything had changed, which told me something painful I would spend months trying not to dwell on. A person can fail to notice your detachment for 2 reasons. Either you are hiding it brilliantly, or they have already stopped looking closely. I spoke less. Not pointedly. Just accurately. I stopped volunteering interpretations. Stopped softening disagreements into humor. Stopped offering free emotional labor to conversations built to convert me into the problem. When Meredith said, one Thursday morning, that the group was considering using our house for a larger fall event because people feel safe here, I almost asked safe from what? Instead I said, I'll be out that night. She didn't even look up from her phone. Fine. That was when I knew the house no longer needed me as a person. It needed my absences to fall in the right places. I told Malcolm before I told anyone else after Nora and Serena. Malcolm and I had been friends since college. He had the deeply useful quality of being unimpressed by ideological theater regardless of who performed it. He also knew Meredith well enough to distinguish her actual values from whatever current vocabulary had wrapped itself around them. We met for drinks after work. I told him the short version first, because men do that, and he made me tell the long version because he is a better friend than I deserved that month. When I finished, he sat back and stared at me. That's not empowerment, he said. That's unilateral control with better branding. I exhaled through my nose. Thank you. He frowned. Do not thank me like I'm saying something brave. I'm saying something obvious. It hasn't felt obvious in my house. That's because your house sounds like a courtroom where one side got to define the dictionary. There it was again. That same recognition from someone outside the orbit of the problem. Language itself had been moved. That was why I kept feeling crazy in precise, specific ways. I was trying to preserve equal meaning in a room that had already decided certain words belonged only to one side. On Friday, Meredith told me the group was having a milestone celebration at our house the following Saturday. Not asked. Told. She wanted a full spread. More elaborate this time. It was important, she said, that the evening reflect abundance, and she didn't trust outside catering to understand the tone. I looked up from my laptop. The tone. Yes. What does that mean? It means I don't want event food. I want care. Care. Another word she still allowed herself to borrow from me without allowing me equal standing in return. She stood in the doorway of the study, the room that used to be ours and was now apparently a symbolic territory. I'll need you to keep the upstairs clear too. Some people may want to decompress away from the main group. It took me a second to understand. The upstairs, I repeated. Yes. As in, the rest of the house. She sighed. Ethan, don't do that thing where you act like every request is exile. Every request is exile. If only she knew how close she had finally gotten to saying the truth out loud. I said I'd handle the food. Why? Because timing matters. Because Serena had told me not to move impulsively. Because I wanted a signed lease, preserved records, a clean account of who had paid what and when, and one uninterrupted window to remove the essentials of my life without making the house itself the site of a fight. Because the part of me that still loved Meredith, even then, did not want the ending of our marriage to happen in a screaming match with half her social circle listening from the next room. But also because the invitation was too perfectly clarifying to waste. If my role in the house had officially become labor plus disappearance, then the cleanest response was not to beg for a different role. It was to stop providing both. The week leading up to that Saturday was one of the quietest of my adult life. I packed slowly. A little each day. Work clothes first. Then casual clothes. Then the framed photograph of my parents from the hallway table, because Meredith had never liked it much and I suddenly understood that if I left it there she would treat it as decor rather than history. Then my grandmother's watch from the top drawer of my dresser. Then the legal folder Serena asked me to keep. Then the external hard drive with tax records. Then the book Nora gave me the year Dad died. Then the cast iron skillet my mother swore was older than most state constitutions. It is strange what people choose when reduced to one carload. You expect yourself to reach for expensive things, but mostly you reach for continuity. The objects that prove you had a self before this house and will have one after it. I moved the boxes a few at a time into the trunk of my car during work hours or while Meredith was out. Not because I wanted theatrics. Because I wanted the act of leaving to remain what it actually was, a completion, not a spectacle. On Thursday night, as the women gathered downstairs again, I sat in the bedroom with an overnight bag already half-packed and listened to the sounds of conversation I no longer needed translated. At one point Meredith's voice rose above the others and I caught a phrase through the floorboards. No more unpaid adaptation. The room hummed approval. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Unpaid adaptation, I thought. That was one way to describe compromise if you needed every mutual adjustment to sound like female martyrdom. It was also one way to erase every invisible thing I had done to keep our life moving. The scheduling. The cooking. The house maintenance. The way I rearranged my work calls around contractors because Meredith hated dealing with them. The weekends I spent painting, repairing, hauling, grocery shopping, assembling, driving, waiting, fixing, remembering. Labor becomes invisible fastest when the person receiving it has a moral reason to stop naming it. Saturday arrived clear and hot. I woke before Meredith and made coffee out of reflex, then stopped halfway through pouring hers because habit and obligation are cousins who look too much alike in the morning. I left the mug empty. She came downstairs an hour later in leggings and a sweatshirt, glanced at the counter, and said, "Are you not making a second pot?" No, she looked mildly surprised, as if weather had briefly changed its mind. "I'm going out for coffee anyway," she said. "Can you start on the salmon after lunch? And don't forget one dessert needs to be gluten-free." I said yes because no longer mattered. Not in the way she thought. While she was out, I packed the last of my things. Not much remained. A few shirts. Toiletries. My laptop. The folder Serena told me not to misplace. I took one last look at the bedroom and felt something complicated move through me. Not grief exactly. Grief is cleaner. More socially recognizable. This was closer to the feeling you get when you finally admit a room has been underwater longer than you wanted to know. Then I went downstairs and cooked. Again, that sounds almost self-erasing when written plainly. Why cook for the last event in a house you are about to leave? Because there is a kind of strength in finishing a role with full consciousness and then refusing ever to perform it again. Because I wanted no accusation later that I had stormed out over a fight and abandoned some emergency. Because I knew Meredith would tell the story strategically and I wanted the facts on my side all the way down to the cooling racks. I cooked carefully. Not out of devotion. Out of finality. A good meal. Better than good, actually. Salmon with lemon and dill. Charred asparagus. Herbed rice. A board of fruit and cheeses. 2 desserts, 1 gluten-free, because even at the end I apparently couldn't stop being precise. By 5:30 the kitchen was spotless. Serving dishes arranged. Labels on the dessert plates. Extra napkins set out. Water pitchers chilled. I even left a note with reheating instructions on the counter because no one would later say I sabotaged anything. At 5:45, Meredith came downstairs in a dark green dress and looked over the spread. "This is good," she said. "Not thank you. Not I appreciate it. Just an evaluation, like a manager checking staging." Then she added, "Try to be gone before everyone settles in. I want tonight to feel completely unedited." Completely unedited. I met her eyes for what felt like the first honest second we'd had in weeks. I wondered if she heard herself at all anymore. Maybe she did. Maybe by then she simply liked the sound. "I'll be out of the way," I said. That much was true. I did not leave a dramatic letter on the bed. I did not place props like evidence in a play. Real life is both less cinematic and more devastating than that. I sent one email. At 5:58 p.m., from the car parked 2 blocks away, I emailed Meredith and copied Serena's office email, because Serena advised me that clean written notice mattered more than theatrical objects. The subject line was simple: temporary separation and next steps. In the message I said that I had left the house voluntarily, that I was safe, that I would communicate through counsel regarding logistics, that no emergency existed, and that I would not be returning that evening. I said the practical arrangements of our life could be handled respectfully, but I would not continue in a marriage where shared space and shared decisions had been systematically redefined to exclude me while still relying on my labor. I asked that she not contact my workplace or family in panic, as no disappearance had occurred. I closed with my new mailing address for legal correspondence. Then I turned my phone off. Not to be cruel. To give the truth time to arrive without immediately being overwritten by performance. I drove downtown to the apartment and carried in the last bag myself. One trip. That was all a marriage had become in physical terms after 7 years. One trip from trunk to elevator to couch. When I closed the apartment door behind me, the silence sounded different from house silence. Not empty. Unclaimed. I sat on the couch in the half-furnished living room and let my body register what my mind had already completed. No shaking hands. No cinematic collapse. Just a long exhale and the strange lightness that comes when an invisible weight is no longer measuring your posture. Driving away did not feel triumphant. That is another lie people tell about leaving. It felt like surfacing. Not joy. Oxygen. I turned my phone back on just after midnight. 31 missed calls. 26 texts. 2 voicemails. 1 message from an unknown number that turned out to be one of the women in the group saying Meredith was very distressed and I needed to stop weaponizing silence. 1 message from Malcolm that just read, "You good?" 1 from Nora that said, "Call when ready." No panic on my end. Meredith's texts evolved exactly the way Serena had predicted. At 6:12, "Where are you?" At 6:19, "This isn't funny." At 6:41, "People are here. You need to answer." At 7:03, "What is this email?" At 7:08, "Are you seriously doing this tonight?" At 7:22, "This is humiliating." At 8:01, "I called your office. They said you left on time." At 8:17, "If you don't answer me, I'm calling the police." At 9:03, "The police said you're an adult and can leave if you want. I hope you're proud of yourself." At 10:14, "How could you do this in front of everyone?" At 11:26, "This is emotional abuse." That last one almost made me laugh. There is a specific kind of person who can build an entire moral framework around their own exclusions and still experience your refusal to remain available as violence. I don't say that to mock her. I say it because once I saw it, I began recognizing how often the language of harm gets used to protect power rather than to describe vulnerability. I texted only once. "I'm safe. I'll respond through the proper channels tomorrow." Then I put the phone face down and slept better than I had in months. The next week was noisier than the marriage itself had been. Mutual friends began receiving edited summaries. I had apparently abandoned my wife in the middle of a meaningful event. I had created a climate of intimidation through withdrawal. I had been quietly resentful of her growth and finally retaliated when I realized I could not control her anymore. One version even suggested I left her with a financial mess and a trashed kitchen, which would have been almost impressive as fiction if the kitchen hadn't looked like a magazine spread when I walked out. This was the part Serena had warned me about. Narrative is leverage. I did not answer everyone. That's another way people lose themselves in divorce. They start trying to manage all interpretations at once, as if reputation can be protected by explanation distributed at scale. It can't. People hear what fits their appetite. The best you can do is tell the truth to the people entitled to it and leave the rest to their own character. I spoke to Nora. To Malcolm. To my mother, who cried, then apologized for crying as if I were the one who needed to manage her emotions. I told her enough, not everything. My mother liked Meredith and still does in the complicated way older women sometimes keep affection for people who have damaged their children. Not because they are blind. Because they understand, sometimes too well, how much foolishness and pride and fear can live inside one human being without entirely canceling whatever was once lovable there. My mother asked only one question that mattered. "Did you leave because you were angry," she said, "or because you were done?" I thought about it. "Done," I said. She was quiet a long time after that. Then she said, "That's harder to fix." Yes. It is. Serena filed within 10 days. The house went on the market discussion list within a month. Meredith wanted to keep it at first, then discovered what upkeep actually costs when every contractor, bill, repair, and schedule is no longer being absorbed by the same invisible system she had spent months calling irrelevant. I don't say that cruelly. Just accurately. Houses are moral clarifiers. Faucets leak whether or not your politics are coherent. Tax notices arrive. Gutters clog. Insurance forms still need signing. The world keeps requiring labor long after ideology has delivered its speech. There were mediation sessions, of course. Ugly ones and boring ones. The ugly parts were mostly administrative in tone, which is how adult lives actually fall apart. Not through shattered vases, but through spreadsheets and disclosures. The boring parts were more draining. Repetition. Clarifications. Competing descriptions of the same events. Meredith never fully denied the language she had used. That would have been too easily disproven by messages and witnesses. Instead, she reframed everything as context. She said she had needed temporary space. She said the group gave her a place to articulate long-suppressed feelings. She said I reacted not to disrespect but to decentering, which I found almost impressive in its confidence. She said I chose abandonment over discomfort. She said the marriage might have been reparable if I had not escalated it into formal separation in such a cold, performative way. That phrase came up more than once. Cold. Calculated. Performative. What she wanted was for quiet action to look like aggression because then her own months of exclusion would remain abstract enough to avoid naming. That is another trick people use when the facts are bad for them. They shift the moral spotlight from the pattern to the style of your exit. I stayed steady. Not saintly. Steady. That matters more. At one mediation session, Meredith actually cried while explaining that she never intended for me to feel unsafe in my own home. Unsafe was not the right word, and I knew it, but the mediator let it hang there because therapists and mediators learn quickly that precision and progress are cousins who do not always travel together. I waited until she finished. Then I said, I did not feel unsafe. I felt removed. The room went still. Because that was the actual word. Not dramatic enough for sympathy campaigns. More dangerous than unsafe in its own way, because it named not one event but a system. Removed. Reduced. Converted from equal partner into tolerated function. I was still welcome as effort, just not as a person with equal standing. I don't know whether Meredith understood that sentence immediately or whether she hated it because she did. Her face changed, though. Not with guilt. With recognition. A few weeks later, outside the courthouse after a procedural hearing that settled almost nothing except timing, she approached me near the concrete benches by the side entrance. It was the first time we had been alone without a mediator, lawyer, or family member somewhere nearby in nearly 2 months. She looked tired. Really tired. Not dramatically disheveled. Just less arranged. As if the version of herself built for public coherence had become expensive to maintain. I still don't understand why you did it like that, she said. Like what? Like I was disposable. Like 7 years could be summarized in an email. I looked at her for a moment. This is the part people expect to become a mic drop scene. But real anger, if it survives long enough, often cools into accuracy. I wasn't interested in winning the exchange. I was interested in telling the truth once, cleanly, without inviting debate. So we're clear, I said, the issue isn't that I left. It's that I stopped leaving pieces of myself behind for you to keep using. She stared at me. That's not fair. No? You act like I banned you from your own life. I almost said yes. Instead, I chose the version with fewer sparks and more force. You kept redesigning our life so I could still provide for it without having equal standing inside it. Her face tightened. That's a very polished way to describe one bad month. One bad month. I said quietly. It wasn't 1 month. 1 month was just when the language got confident enough to stop hiding. She folded her arms. A familiar gesture. Protective, combative, adolescent all at once. I was trying to create space where I didn't have to filter everything through a man. And I was your husband. That doesn't make you exempt from taking up space. I did not ask to be exempt. I asked to remain included. She looked away first. There are moments when someone knows the argument they brought no longer fits the facts in front of them, and you can actually watch them decide whether pride or honesty gets the next sentence. Pride won. This whole thing, she said, the apartment, the legal paperwork, the silence, the timing. It was punishing. I nodded once. No, I said. It was final. That was the word she had never wanted. Because punishment implies relationship. Finality implies recognition. One can be negotiated. The other means the truth has already become structure. She shook her head, almost laughing, and said, "You really found the coldest possible way to prove your point." I looked at the courthouse doors behind her, then back at her face, and something inside me settled for good. For months I had been trying to make the story sound moderate enough to survive telling. Not anymore. "What you wanted," I said, "was a home where my perspective only counted when it was useful. My leaving felt cold because it was the first decision I made that you couldn't rename while it was happening." She opened her mouth, then closed it. No comeback. No reframing. No layers. Just the sudden visible inconvenience of reality. I walked away before either of us had to ruin the moment by adding anything else. People have asked me since then whether I regret not fighting harder to save the marriage. The kind version of that question comes from people who mean well. The cruel version comes from people who think endurance is a moral achievement regardless of what it costs. My answer is the same to both. You can fight for a relationship when the other person still believes you belong equally inside it. You cannot fight your way back into a role someone has already morally downgraded. At that point you are not saving the marriage. You are auditioning for revised terms. I had no interest in auditioning. The divorce was finalized 5 months after I moved out. Not fast, not slow. Adult lives take time to unthread. The house sold. Assets were divided. A few mutual friends drifted away in the direction of the more emotionally convenient story. A few others circled back once the dust settled and the facts stopped needing performance. Malcolm still calls every Thursday sometimes, not because he thinks I'm fragile but because he thinks ritual matters. Nora sent me a housewarming gift for the apartment when I renewed the lease and wrote, on the card, "Better a small honest room than a large dishonest one." My mother still asks whether I'm eating enough, like divorce changes a man's vitamin requirements. As for Meredith, I don't hate her. That surprises people. Hatred would be cleaner, maybe. Easier to narrate. But hatred requires a kind of simplicity I no longer think she deserves. Meredith was not a cartoon villain. She was not secretly cruel from the day I met her. She was a smart, wounded, ambitious woman who found language that explained some real injuries and then kept using that language after it stopped clarifying and started excusing. She liked how powerful it felt to frame inconvenience as oppression and collaboration as interference. She liked how those words removed the burden of negotiating with someone whose needs mattered as much as hers. Maybe she believed every step of it. Maybe belief and benefit had become too tangled by then to separate. What I know is this: once she started treating my inclusion as optional and my usefulness as mandatory, the marriage did not have a philosophical disagreement. It had a terminal problem. I live in a different apartment now. Better light. Slightly less disappointing couch. The first thing I bought after the divorce was a dining table that seats 4, which amused Nora because, in her words, apparently I had not been traumatized enough to give up chairs. She was joking, but there was a truth under it. I did not want my life organized by avoidance. I did not want Meredith's vocabulary becoming architecture inside me. Sometimes Thursday evenings still make me pause. Not because I miss the marriage in some sentimental, ache-filled way. More because I can feel, in my body, how long I spent trying to stay calm in a story that kept moving the definitions. Thursdays remind me that relationships do not always die from screaming. Sometimes they die from interpretive monopoly. One person gets to define what counts as care, what counts as intrusion, what counts as harm, what counts as fairness. The other person keeps showing up with groceries and patience and practical questions until one day he realizes he is no longer a husband there. Just a tolerated inconvenience with good knife skills. That realization changed me. Not in the way internet people like to fantasize, where a man becomes cold forever and mistakes emotional amputation for wisdom. I still want partnership. I still believe in shared life, shared decisions, shared rooms, shared language. If anything, I believe in them more now, because I know what it feels like when those things are withdrawn while the furniture still suggests marriage. But I am less willing to let beautiful words do ugly work. That might be the only gift the whole thing left me. If someone says boundary when they mean hierarchy, I hear it faster now. If someone says space when they mean obedience, I hear it faster. If someone says support when they mean service, I hear that too. And if a room starts getting smaller around me while everyone insists I'm still fully welcome, I no longer wait for a dramatic moment to justify noticing. I notice. Then I decide. That is the part Meredith never understood. She thought the end of the marriage was the night I left. Or the email. Or the apartment. Or the hearing. She thought endings announced themselves with events. But the marriage ended earlier than that. It ended the first time my ordinary place in our life together was treated like a male intrusion instead of a husband standing. It ended when routine collaboration began getting translated as domination because the translation was useful. It ended when my labor remained welcome after my perspective stopped being allowed. By the time I packed a bag, the marriage had already been moved somewhere I could no longer reach. The apartment is quiet now when I eat. Not lonely. Quiet. There's a difference. Sometimes I sit at that 4-seat table with takeout and a legal pad from work and think about how close I came to staying longer out of sheer embarrassment. Not because I didn't know what was happening, but because I worried it would sound too small to explain. No one wants to say out loud that a marriage ended partly because of language. Because of chairs. Because of tone. Because of who gets named relevant in a room. But that's how respect actually dies. Not always through spectacular betrayal. Sometimes through repeated tiny redesigns of equality until one person is expected to be grateful for whatever corner remains. I am not grateful for corners anymore. And that, more than the lease or the filing or the court date, is why I left.